11.
It's like that dream you have when you go to math class and you're not wearing any pants. You know, everyone's staring at you.
You know, actually, I have this recurrent dream in which I discover that I'm naked in public, talking to people in their clothes. And my reaction in the dream is I say, you know, this is just like those dreams where you appear naked suddenly, and you realize you're naked in front of other people who are clothed. And it doesn't bother me them either.
It's an infinite regress series.
And so, you know, it's like I don't get stage fright. I have dreams about not getting stage fright.
Well, you consider being made naked in public to be a form of noblesse oblige, anyway. Well, you're the technician, so whatever you want.
I would say, look at each other, look at the audience, don't sweat this out.
Oh, all right. We could write our answers out on tablets and fold them up.
You could.
You could write them on paper and throw them to the crowd and fight over the answers, and whoever got it would know. Nobody else
We
would.
could carve our answers on stone tablets in ancient Sumerian hieroglyphics and fold them up.
That was how John W. Campbell did it.
Yeah. In fact, that's what made it so difficult to get a rejection letter from John W. Campbell. It was on a stone tablet carved with Sumerian hieroglyphics.
Oh, that wasn't the hard part. The hard part was to deliver tied to a spear. You had to be tough to submit to the scientific.
You did. Actually, I believe it was an unladen swallow. It was an African swallow.
No, you had to submit your stories attached to an African swallow because they were what John W. Campbell ate.
Yes, he had the African swallow for lunch, and then he sent you your stone tablet. What? They're all complaining they can't hear us.
No, they're complaining they can hear you, Gardner.
That's what I would have thought, but no.
Can you hear now?
They're not talking.
They're not talking.
Say something.
Can you hear now? I am Oz, the great and powerful. Pay no attention to Michael Swanwick behind the curtain. I will now sing while he drinks a glass of water.
He will now fart. Well,
No, we don't want to clear the room yet.
now, is his microphone on or do I have to shout?
No, they're all saying they can't hear
Can't
anything.
hear, okay.
Make the mic closer.
Can't hear Michael.
That's because I can't yell as loud as you are.
Well, few people can.
Okay, how about now?
Yeah.
All
Move it
right. How
closer.
about the back? Can you hear me? They're not
They're not paying any attention, so they don't.
They're the bad kids back there. They're smoking cigarettes and saying bad words.
Look, that guy's got gum. Scott, you've got gum. I hope you brought enough for everyone.
No, but I have plenty of durian candy.
Well, anyone who wants durian candy, hold up your hands. Scott has a bag full of it here. We'll just have to talk like this throughout the entire interview.
Did Michael bring a taser?
They're complaining, not me. I don't care. Can you hear us now?
Okay, let's see. We'll just go on whether they can hear us or not.
Gee, we could carry on the whole interview in sign language. If only I knew sign language. We'll have to make up.
All right, let's start seriously. I was at the Worldcon either last year or the year before, and I ran across Robert Silverberg in the con suite, within the con suite of the in the Syphilis suite, and he wasn't wearing his name badge. And I said, "Bob, you're not wearing your name badge." He looked at me and said, "It will be a sorry day when Robert Silverberg has to wear a name badge in the Syphilis suite at the Worldcon." And it will be a sorry day when Gardner Dozois needs an introduction at Readercon for the people here to be told who they are, who he is. Do you guys know who this guy is?
Philadelphia, PA, I think.
Well, Gardner Dozois is on the very short form. He used to have a little table in his living room, and he kept all his awards on it. And it was this vulgar display of Hugos, looking like a display at a sex shop. And then gleaming among them with virginal purity, 2 nebulas for short fiction. And that is...
Looking like a display in a sex shop for those who didn't care if it was really painful.
So that also is Gardner Dozois. Gardner, congratulations on being inducted into the Science Fiction Hall of Fame. What did that
Well, when they told me that, I said, you know, do I have to be stuffed and mounted now? Which didn't really sound that bad, depending on who did the stuffing and the mounting. Well, it was a great honor, of course, and I was happy to accept it. But I've never really been all that impressed with myself, and I am not still all that impressed with myself. I think I worked very hard at Asimov's, and I think I did a good job. But I'm sure that there's any number of other people who could have done the same job. As I said when I accepted the Hall of Fame award, if you think that Asimov's published a lot of good stories, if you think that there's a lot of good stories in the best of the year, then the people you should be thanking are all the men and women who wrote the stories and did all the hard work. I mean, I was just shrewd enough to recognize good work when I saw it and buy it. But it's not, you know, I can't really claim responsibility for the production of all this good work, because it was the writers that did that.
When I met you was in 1974, and you seemed at that time so much older and more worldly and more experienced than I. And I realize now that you were only 3 years older than me. You were like 27 at that time.
But I had an old soul.
Well, you got. How did you discover?
I turned right and connected.
You sold your first story when you were 17. And
Yeah.
You were in the army.
Yeah.
You sold. It got published. How had you decided at that young age that it was science fiction that you wanted to write?
Well, it's a complicated and mostly boring process. I started off reading things like Kipling's The Jungle Books, and then I got into Boy's Adventure series about animals, like Albert Paxton Terhune, one of the worst writers in the known universe, God help us. But I read all of his books about heroic collies, and the farmer would come and find his chickens all dead, and there would be the collie with blood all over his face and feathers, but it would turn out that some sneaking, thieving lowlife had snuck in and killed the chickens and rubbed the blood and the feathers all over the heroic collie's face. And I also read books about, you know, horses like Walter Farley, and I much later on realized that what I was looking for in all of this stuff was a view of a life that was not mine. I was not a particularly happy kid. I didn't much like the life I was living, and I wanted to live somebody else's life. And I eventually realized that the most pure quill way of getting that was from science fiction, which almost by definition, you know, shows you what it's like to be another type of person and live in a different skin and look at the world through different eyes. And there are other places you can get that, but for the real jolt, I eventually realized that science fiction was where you had to go for that.
Well, you were released from the army. You, for a while, you stayed in Germany and starved.
Yeah,
And then you went to England and
I
starved.
starved, believe it or not.
I have pictures of this man looking gaunt as a wraith.
When I came home from the army, I was 6 feet tall and I weighed 160 pounds. And people used to say I looked like a concentration camp victim. And mothers would come up on the street and give me sandwiches. People I didn't even know. Eat.
And then you went to England for a while and starved, but finally you decided to come back to the United States of America and starve in New York.
Yes. Well, I've starved in some of the best cities on earth. I remember when we lived in Germany, it was a bunch of ex-soldiers just released from the army, and we shared a hideous garret in this little farming community in Germany called the Zerndorf. And we shared it with whatever itinerant passing hippie girls we could lure up to our lair. And we once survived an entire month on a box of oxtail soup consomme cubes that a hitchhiker who we had let crash there for a night dropped off. And when I was starving in New York, my way of getting through was they had at the time frozen veal cutlet patties that came in a box with 6 of them. So you would eat a veal cutlet sandwich a day, and then on the 7th day you would eat like a ketchup sandwich, a mustard sandwich or something. So, yeah, those were skimpy days.
And you started editing in New York City then. How was it exactly with whom again?
Well, it's again a complicated and boring story. I started out doing readers' reports for Dell books, not Dell magazines. And I would read a book that was in the slush pile and explain in great detail why I thought it sucked, and I would give it to the editor. But the only reason I got to do that, or in fact probably any of the other stuff that I did after that, was because I had started selling stories while I was overseas to Damon Knight's Orbit anthology. And so when I got back to the country, I landed at Fort Dix, New Jersey, and I had like $20 or something in my pocket. This was the only money I had in the world. And all I had was the clothes I had on my back, which was a pair of combat boots and an old fatigue jacket and some kind of a shirt and pants. And Damon Knight had been incautious enough to invite me to come stay with him for a few days while I got back on my feet after landing in the States again. So I went, I had just enough money left to get a bus to Milford, Pennsylvania, which is where Damon was living. And he met me at the bus station. And the look of frozen horror on his face when I came towards him saying, "Hi, Damon," was, because as he later said, he was this raggedy clothed giant with, wild, weird hair and a huge beard. And, poor Damon was terrified. But the reason why I'm mentioning all this is I did stay there. It turned out to be more like 3 weeks before they finally kicked me out. But because I got to meet quite a few people at Damon's house, and because my first stories were coming out in Orbit, and I was starting to get a reputation as a hot young Turk, when a publisher in New York was looking for somebody to do scut work reading stuff for almost nothing, my name came up because of those contacts. It's the same way I ended up a little bit later reading the Galaxy slush pile because I was willing to read an immense amount of stuff for the the ability to lick a donut every once in a while. They wouldn't actually let me bite it. I could take the lick and snatch it back. And so I read the Galaxy slush pile. At that point, the UPD group of magazines consisted of Galaxy, Worlds of If, Worlds of Tomorrow, Worlds of Fantasy. And I read all of those at once. And there was, at the time, what's famous at the time, but nobody has ever heard of it since, there was a problem called the Galaxy Backlog, which after Fred Pohl had left, and before Jake Jacobson took over, nobody had read any submitted manuscripts for like 7 months, so there were like immense piles of them. And I broke the Galaxy Backlog, and they actually let me have a small bite of the donut. So, I was in the right place at the right time. I was getting a reputation as a young professional writer. I knew people from having met them at Damon Knight's house. People like Damon Knight would recommend me. So that's sort of how I got into the editing game.
How did you wind up in Philadelphia?
Well, it's all Susan Casper's fault, actually. I had a girlfriend in Philadelphia called Susan Casper, and I ended up going down to see her every 3 or 4 days. And one time I went down there and on the bus and left, and then came back the next day on the bus. And eventually we said, well, this is silly. You might as well just move to Philadelphia. So that's what I did.
How did you meet Jack Dan?
Well, that's a funny. Do all of you know Jack Dan? He has not been seen much in American fandom for a long time. He's a writer. When I met him, he lived in Binghamton, New York, upstate New York. And he's been living in Australia now for about 15 years, I guess. And I met him at a collating party that Anne McCaffrey was throwing at her house in Seagate in Brooklyn to collate the Cephal Bulletin. And in those days, probably most of you don't even know what collating is. In those days, if you were doing a fanzine or something like the Cephal Bulletin, they would lay the pages out around the sides of a table, and the volunteers would trudge round and round, taking one page and putting it on the next. And then at the end, somebody would staple it together. And that's where I met Jack Dan. Since subsequently became one of my best friends, the interesting part is that when I first met him, we absolutely loathed each other. We had an instinctual, instant dislike reaction. And it took us several months to get over that and realize we actually liked each other. You have to understand that Jack at that point was in his James Dean phase, and he had on a black leather jacket, and he had his hair slicked back at a duck's ass, very heavy with grease, and he was wearing sunglasses even though he was inside at night. So it took a while to get beyond this facade and realize that he was actually just a nice Jewish intellectual boy from upstate New York rather than a street hood, which is sort of what he was trying to project.
So you, at the beginning of your career, there's a group of writers who kind of coalesced. There's yourself, Joe Haldeman, Jay Haldeman, Ed Bryant,
George Martin,
the Failures Group.
The Failures Group. I really had high hopes for George. I really thought someday he would make it. I would have taken bets that he would make it someday, but no. Yeah, we were the hot young Turks. We met at science fiction conventions on the East Coast, and half of us are dead now, unfortunately. There was Jay Haldeman, who was Joe Haldeman's brother, and he's gone, and George Alec Effinger, and he's gone, and you know, Jack moved to Australia.
The same as being dead.
Same as being dead. And you know, George ascended into the godhood with like Jesus rays coming out of him. And the thing we had in common was that we were all young science fiction writers. We're all very ambitious writers, and we were all dead broke, you know. And we were like less than dust beneath the wheels of the science fiction establishment at that point. I remember we did a panel at Lunacon one year. It must have been like 70, maybe 71, somewhere in there. And Harlan Ellison was introducing us all. It was a new writers panel. And he introduced us, all of us starving writers. And everybody that I just named were on that panel, I'm pretty sure. And he tried to do his Sea of Green evangelical routine to raise money for us, because we actually didn't have enough money to get anything for dinner that night between the 5 or 6 of us. And so he went down to the audience, he was waving $1 and saying, "Let's see a sea of green for these poor starving writers," and nobody was giving us anything. They were all sitting on their wallets. And then I leaned forward and I said, "The first person to hit Jack Dad in the nose with a quarter gets a special prize." And instantly the air was split. And we counted it afterwards, and we got about $15. It was pretty good. It was enough to split a pizza. I remember at the same convention, Joe Haldeman and I had put together all of our change, and we had just enough money to buy a gallon of Boone's Farm apple wine, which we then carried around from room party to room party, pouring drinks for each other because we were too poor to buy any drinks. And Boone's Farm apple was the drink of choice of starving young writers in the 70s, not because it was any good, in fact it was horrendously bad, but because it only cost 99 cents. You know, the only place to go below that was Night Train. Sterno, perhaps.
You are one of the most important editors in the field of science fiction.
You did say important, right?
Important. So I believe everybody here will be interested in hearing the passing of the torch moment when you met John W. Campbell.
Well, actually, I did have such a moment, and it's the only time I ever met Campbell, and it was the end of his life, and he was dead within about a month after this Lunacon that I've been talking about in New York City. I think he was the guest of honor, and I was in the huckster room with Damon Knight, and Damon Knight dragged me up to Campbell, who also looked horrified at having me dragged towards him. And I still had the same Army field jacket and stuff on. I didn't really have any other clothes. And Damon dragged me towards Campbell and said, "This is a really hot young writer. You should meet him." And I don't think Campbell ever actually focused on me. He got a look of automatic horror and started saying, hard science, no new wave stuff. Analog wants hard science, none of this new wave stuff. And he sort of backed away. And that was pretty much the extent of my conversation with him. Except that we ended up going up in the same elevator from the huckster room afterwards, and he sort of sighed and complained to his wife about the burdens of being a great man. they had been making him sign autographs. He didn't, you know, he never noticed me. He didn't give a crap about me. So if you consider that a passing of the torch, I mean, he certainly never said to me, "Here's my torch, oh noble Gardner. You will carry science fiction into the future while I falter and fall by the wayside." It makes a better story that way. It's not how it happened.
You have written a large number of short stories over the years. You're primarily known for that, but you're also known for your novel, Strangers. Tell us about the experience of writing that.
Well, it was tough. I have a short attention span, which I think is why I've mostly written short stories. And I had signed to do this novel for David Hartwell, and it had a distinct deadline, and I was finding it very difficult to make it.
How long did he give you?
It was like 3 months or something like that, 4 months.
3 months to write a novel.
And, well, to be fair, I had already written some of it. I had written the novella version of Strangers first, and that had already been published in New Dimensions. So as I'm sure you remember very well, since you were hanging out with us at that point, I used to go into the park because it was the only way that I could keep from being distracted and, frankly, keep myself awake. And I would sit there in the park on a little bench, and I would write in my notebook while squirrels scampered by and dropped pine nuts on me, and people went by with their dogs and stuff. And then at the end of the day, Susan and often Michael would come and sort of pry me up out of the bench and then take me off to have dinner in some sleazy diner somewhere.
The Midtown.
The Midtown, yes. No, it wasn't the Midtown, it was the Savoy.
Oh, yes, that's right.
The Savoy.
Yes, we wish we could have been in the Midtown.
Yeah, we weren't good enough for the Midtown. But, yeah, that's how I did it. You know, the idea had come, people often ask me, well, how did you come up with the idea for that? Or what does this mean in this particular story? And I say, I wrote that 40 years ago. I don't have the slightest idea what I had meant by that. You know, if you got into a time machine and went back and asked the skinny, intense young kid I was what it meant, he would give you chapter and verse of why he put it in and what the symbolism was and everything, but I don't remember that anymore.
Now, was it that book that had for the author's picture the photograph of you working on the novel, the last little bits of the novel, sitting on the toilet in Trina King's apartment?
No, you're mixing this up a little. I did write a chapter of the novel sitting at night on the bathroom floor next to the toilet in Trina King's apartment because everyone else in the apartment was asleep. So that was the only place I could leave the light on. But my first book was a now obscure anthology called A Day in the Life, a reprint anthology. And they used an author's photo of me in my incredibly run-down, sleazy, dilapidated apartment in the East Village on East 10th Street between 1st and Avenue A, which is where the Viet Cong used to send their troops for survival training, ship them over to Vietnam. And the pictures of me sitting at the table eating an English muffin. I'm actually in the process of putting some jelly on it. And the picture was taken by surprise, so I have this sort of wary recognition. What the hell? And behind me, in all of its splendor, is my toilet. Perhaps an indication of where my career was going to go. In future years, I should have paid more attention to that. And so I believe I'm the only, maybe the only, certainly the first science fiction writer ever to have a picture of his toilet appear as his author's. Yeah, yeah.
Or,
Well,
Asimov.
associate editor for George Sithers when he started up Asimov's. He came to me because we were both living in Philadelphia, and I was the only one in Philadelphia who had any experience in working on a science fiction magazine because I had done the Galaxy group for several years. So we founded Asimov's together. We worked together for about a year, and then we went our separate ways. It became clear that we were not aesthetically compatible. And I was basically weeding the slush for him. But when we got to the point where he was passing up the stories that I sent up to him for consideration and buying the things that I didn't think were any good, I said, well, this isn't going to work. So we parted ways. And I guess it was about 10 years later, George had left the magazine at this point, and they had gone through, very briefly, Catherine Maloney, I think her name was, and then they had gotten Shauna McCarthy. And Shauna McCarthy had made a real success of the magazine, and she had won a Hugo Award for her editing of the magazine, and then she quit. She decided she was going to become a book editor, and she went over to Bantam, and that left them without an editor. And basically the reason why I ended up working for Asimov's again, it was all Shauna's fault. Because I was at the Nebula banquet in New York where I won a Nebula for my story, Morning Child. And she came up to me and she said, "Hey Gardner, would you like to edit Asimov's?" And I said, "Whoa, all right." I guess so. And she knew that I was serious about science fiction and that I was serious about standards of writing and quality of prose and like that. So she pretty much decided that I ought to be her successor at Asimov's. And she sort of fought to get me in, and I went and interviewed. I got my hair cut for the first time in like 15 years, and went and interviewed for the job, and somewhat to my surprise, actually got it. And I was certain throughout the first 3 or 4 years at Asimov's that I was going to be fired at any minute, because even with my shabby new suit and my haircut, I did not really fit in well to the corporate ambiance. And it was clear I was not a corporate sort of fellow. And they were all looking suspiciously at me in the corridors. So I knew my time was going to be short. And in a way, this was a good thing, because I said, well, I've got nothing to lose. They're going to fire me anyway. So I let the writers take risks, and I took risks with what kind of stories I published. And I think that actually, put my imprint on the magazine faster than it might otherwise if I had been more cautious. And it turned out they didn't fire me, at least then. And I got 20 years out of it. So
I remember when you went in, you told me you had a number of ambitions for the magazine, things you wanted to do, and one of them was that you were hoping to get 2 or maybe 3 more stories of an almost unwritten subgenre called alternate history.
yeah.
I think that kind of backfired on you.
Yeah, well, and did they give me any money for it? No. One of the advantages I had going into Asimov is, we haven't even gotten into this, but by the time I went into editing Asimov's, I had already been a Best of the Year editor for a number of years. First, for a series of 6 books with Dutton, where I took over Lester Del Rey's old Best of the Year. And then when that died, Jim Frankel came up with the idea of starting a new Best of the Year series for Blue Jay, his then new publishing company, which eventually was taken over by St. Martin's Press when Blue Jay died. So I was like, I believe 3 books into the Blue Jay series, and with the other 6 books at Dutton behind me by the time I became the Asimov's editor. And so I knew from the reading I did every year for the best of the year that there were lots of young writers out there, new young writers who were being underutilized by the science fiction magazine genre of the time. I knew who was writing the good, exciting new stuff, and I'd worked with most of them. So that gave me a big advantage, because when I came in, I could tap people like you and John Kessel and James Patrick Kelly and Pat Cadigan and Bill Gibson and Bruce Sterling and all these people. I already knew what they were doing, and that I liked what they were doing. So, you know, I brought them all into the magazine. And that's pretty much what you've got to do, is stay receptive to the new talent that arises out there. I mean, people, you know, ask me sometimes, you know, why are you an editor like Campbell? And no, I'm not an editor like Campbell. Campbell was a proactive editor. He would assign stories to people. He would say, well, you should write a story about this, and you know, and people in awe of him would say, oh, okay, and they would go write the story. And so he was very proactive. I've never been a proactive editor. I've always been a receptive editor. I mean, my job was to see what was happening of interest out there and be receptive to giving it a chance in the magazine. And the best of the year anthology and the magazine always helped each other in that respect, because not only was I reading the slush pile and the prose submissions for the Asimovs, I was also reading everything else that everybody published in English language publications. So if somebody popped up, you know, a new writer popped up doing something interesting, you know, I said, well, all right, well, you know, let's see if we can get him in Asimov's. It was like the same with Greg Egan and Steve Baxter, and, you know, different surges of new talent came along over those 20 years. But I like to pride myself that the one thing I really did right was stay receptive to what new young writers of merit were coming along and give them a shot to, you know, showcase their work.
How does your being a writer affect your editing?
Well, I suppose it does. I can't stand bad prose writing, so I tended naturally towards stories that were elegantly written line by line. And sometimes to the dismay of the audience, I probably should have. But I think being a writer gave me the ability to recognize when things were going wrong with some particular piece, or, you know, when a sentence needed some kind of polishing, or, you know, they had taken a character in the wrong direction or something. And occasionally then I would suggest to people that, you know, this story would work better if you did that. But I never tried to use a bully pulpit on them. I never said, well, you've got to change this. I would explain the reasons why I thought they should change it. And if they agreed, then fine, they would change it. If they didn't agree, then I would say, well, you know, you should probably take this and go sell it somewhere else. And I don't like trying to force my opinions down the throats of writers.
You rather famously, though, took a novel by Joe Haldeman, the Hemingway books, and cut it down to a novella, which then proceeded to win the Hugo, was it?
Yeah, it was a Hugo.
Proceeded with Hugo. But you could do that because he was your friend.
Well, actually, he sort of asked me to do it. He had this novel, The Hemingway Hoax, and I said, well, I can't serialize anything at the moment. It's too long to put it in the magazine. He said, well, why don't you see if you can cut it down and get it in as a novella? And I had actually done this several times before. I did it with Jack McDevitt's first novel, the Hercules text, and with a couple of other novels over the years. And I said, oh, well, okay. And I worked on it and came up with the novella version. And I showed it to Joe, and he said, you cut all the sex scenes out. And I cut all the sex scenes out, but the sex scenes were not germane to the plot. All you have to do that is to only leave in things that drive the plot or establish character. And the sex scenes were not doing either of those tasks, so therefore they were expendable. It's rather appalling, actually, how many really long novels you can cut down to novella length just by cutting out everything that's extraneous and not really needed.
There are a couple of times over the decades when you had a party at your house and Mary Ann and my wife would find a couple of the little proto-editorial people from New York, the new ones, sort of monotonous and unformed, staring at your sex display.
Those who had not yet been allowed to lick the donut. and being surprised to discover the nebulas for short fiction there. Mary Ann was always careful to sort of slip in at this point and say, yes, some of us think Gardner's a much better writer than he is an editor. And how do you reconcile or maybe balance the two impulses to write and to edit? Well, I edit much faster than I write, so it's never really been that much of a problem to balance them. I've never been a prolific writer. I'm a slow and painful writer. If I can squeeze out a story a year, I'm doing okay. And you can't make a living like that. So the fact that I could make a living, such as it is, by editing and actually enjoy the work that I was doing, it's a no-brainer, really. I mean, whatever else it is come out of my science fiction editing career, it has kept me from having to say, do you want fries with that? And considering that my father wanted me to get a job in the same chemical factory that he worked in, and was disappointed to the day he died that I never got a, quote, real job, unquote. I think I did okay in that respect. At least I didn't have to work in the fucking chemical factory. Should I tell them the slush pile story now?
Oh, yes, you should.
I had a New Year's Eve party over my house one year. I'd been in Asimov's a couple of years by then, and a lot of young writers came over, and they were sitting around, and I had prearranged this with Susan. We had a fireplace in my apartment, and I had a great big cardboard box overflowing with slush manuscripts, and I would establish that these were the slush manuscripts for Asimov's. And occasionally Susan would say, hey, the fire is dying down. And I would say, hand me some slush. And I would take a big handful of manuscripts and throw them onto the fire. And their eyes would widen. They didn't know they were all disposable manuscripts that I had already dealt with.
It confirmed everything.
Editors really are like that.
As you obliquely referred to, you probably have a better idea of the landscape of science fiction over the past 30 years, having read pretty much all the short fiction, at least, and a great deal of the novels as well, every year. What broad changes do you see in science fiction over that time?
Well, of course, the big change is technical. It's not really a change in the genre itself. We're basically in a situation where we're switching over from print to electronic media, And I don't think print will ever entirely disappear. I think there'll always be bookstores and print books. But I think the bulk of it is going to swing to electronic media, e-books and e-readers. And I don't really care. I mean, if I'm reading a good story, I don't care whether it's on the page or whether it's on the screen of an e-reader. So it doesn't really scare me that much that this big electronic revolution is going on. The stories remain, if the stories remain good, it doesn't really matter. Now the other thing I can see happening, which I'm not quite as in tune with, but then I am an old dinosaur, is there's been a lot of blurring of genre boundaries over the last 10 years, where it's sometimes hard to tell, where one genre ends and the other one takes off. And sometimes I have gotten science fiction anthologies that say science fiction in big letters on the title page, and have found no real science fiction stories in there.
Science fiction now with the world.
Yeah. And, that's okay. There's a perfectly valid place in literature for that. But it's not entirely to my taste. I would prefer to see actual science fiction. I enjoy reading a lot of the slipstream and the mixed science fiction fantasy things, but my heart still basically belongs to science fiction. So in that respect, I'm becoming more obsolete every year, because it's clear that everybody else is moving in the opposite direction. It also causes me trouble with the best of the year, because it says the year's best science fiction on it. So I feel obligated to find actual science fiction stories for the book, although I have a broad church enough definition that I can push the boundaries every once in a while and get some stuff that Campbell probably wouldn't have liked into the magazine.
We are down to our last couple of minutes. Does anybody have a compelling question and not a comment?
Oh, I had always wanted to say this, so I was. There's a TV show on PBS called Inside the Actors Studio. Have you ever seen this? And the host always asks the guests the question: if heaven is real, what would you want God to say to you when you arrive at the pearly gates? And since I'm never going to get on that program, I'll answer it here. My answer was, I'd like to hear God say, "You could have done worse."
I don't think there's any better point to stop from there. Gardner deserves a huge round of applause.
My publisher will be remiss with me if I didn't throw in that you should rush in a buying frenzy to the bookstore dealer's room and get a copy of my new collection, When the Great Days Come, from the Prime Books table. And there's also my new Best of the Year, Best SF 28 is in there too. So go forth and buy.